Hello and welcome to the International Sustainable Resilience Center webinar, Practical Tools to Implement Resilient People First Public-Private Partnerships. Kim? Next slide. Today's agenda is pretty simple. We will introduce our three speakers. We will talk about, for a brief time, resilience, new paradigms, a practical assessment tool, drivers of the P3, another acronym for public-private partnerships, need and available resources, and guidelines and resources for P3s that create resilient communities. Next. I am your host, David Dodd. I am the founder and CEO of the ISRC. Kim Smith, who is our special projects manager, will be moderating this discussion. Kim is.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, David. I was just going to say, I'll be moderating the chat window as well as the Q&A window. So the desire for us today's format is really to have a conversation with everyone. So please feel free to submit those and we will pull them up for our conversation at the end. Thank you, David.
No, thanks, Kim. Thanks for elaborating on that. The ISRC is one of 8 international specialist centers of excellence under the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe International PPP Center of Excellence, which is headquartered in Geneva. It's a global organization. And we are affiliated with the International Center of Excellence through an MOU. So we're not under the UN, we are affiliated with that organization. And we're now actively focused on supporting PPPs to support COVID-19 adaptation around the world. And we are still focused also on natural disasters, which I often say that natural disasters could care less about COVID-19. More natural disasters occurred in 2020 than any year before. Kim? Are we having problems, Kim, or?
We can.
No. Are you not seeing the slides, Advance?
No.
We can see it.
Now I see it. I must be having problems. Sorry about that. Our panelists were very honored to have 3 leading voices in the arena of resilient public-private partnerships. First is David Baxter. He's Senior PPP Advisor for ISRC. He is also an independent consultant to governments, development agencies, and institutions. He's widely regarded as the top independent public-private partnership expert in the world. Richard Seeline. Richard and I have very similar backgrounds. Richard has had more than 30 years of management and consulting services. A lot of that time was in economic development, which is the field that I came from. Now he is a leader in resilience innovation through the Resilience Innovation Hub. And he's also managing director of Resilient H2O Partners, a funding mechanism for these types of innovations in resilience. And Richard has expertise in PPPs as well. Our third panelist is Joel Thomas. He leads spin Global, a Maryland-based business that exists to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. Joel literally wrote the book for NEMA, the National Emergency Management Association, and FEMA and NATO. Joel is a very highly regarded expert in the field of resilience and PPPs. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, David, so we can begin our discussion.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. I am David Baxter. I'm known to many of you, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the resilience paradigms, new practical tools that exist there. Kim, if you could do the next slide. So one thing that I want to point out, and we've learned this recently in Texas, that resilience is not planning for the best scenario, the case scenario. It's basically preparing for the worst. And you know, Texas unfortunately suffered a transnational infrastructure super convergence failure event that impacted its southern neighbor as well, and then compromised the safety of its citizens. This is a costly outcome of a neglect of resilience. And strange enough, which I read, is that the cost is going to be about $40 million in additional energy costs. 40 billion, sorry, in additional energy costs to the citizens of Texas. Can you imagine how far they could have got if they had spent that money on future-proofing or climate-proofing their infrastructure? And so I feel very strongly that resilience is not planning for the best case scenario or cutting corners for maintenance and believing that events of this type will never happen to us, because they can happen even though you don't expect it. Next slide. Typically, internationally, there are basically 5 pillars that are addressed when one looks at a resilience strategy, which should be addressed. One is ensuring that there's threshold capacity. Do you have the threshold to face it? Coping capacity. Do you have the mechanisms in place? Recovery capacity, you know, can you recover and how quickly can you recover? Adaptive capacity, and that's adapting to the circumstances continuously so that you still do have a resilient system. And then transformative capacity, which is looking at how you can transform everything as you go through. For those who do want to find a little bit or read a little bit more about it, you can see a blog that I wrote on January the 17th in that regard. Next slide. We're also working, and you would have seen in the title, on People First Public-Private Partnerships. This is basically a new approach to PPPs. It doesn't undo the way PPPs have done in the past, but what we're looking at is, instead of just looking at value for money, we're also looking at value for people and value for the future. And there are 10 principles that are involved with this, which were determined and developed by a United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's working group. And some of these principles really make sense. For example, building into infrastructure strategies that have people first transformative agendas. You know, principle 3, increasing official skills. This is critically important. Also making sure that there's a more inclusive policy and legal framework. And this is a big downfall or a shortcoming that we faced when we had the situation in Texas, that the policy was not up to date, the frameworks weren't there, disclosing information was not taking place as quickly as it should. Principle 6 is incredibly important, and that is de-risking projects by providing more predictability. And we go on, you know, through the list. But I think one thing that's really important is we need to make sure that we have environmental sustainability as a key component of everything we do. If you don't like the term climate change, then you can call it adverse weather events or climate adaptability. But it's really important that these principles are adopted. Next slide. If you want to actually see more about it, you can go to the UNEC website, and they have a website, and this is just a screen capture of the website that talks about promoting people first for PPPs for sustainable development. And they have experts that work there, international standards, examples of PPP, people first PPP projects. and the list of the international centers, of which ISRC is one. One thing that's come out, and this is a really important tool, it's in draft form, but it should be finalized pretty soon, is an assessment tool that has been developed, which allows proponents of projects to determine whether their tools are people first PPP ones. There's an evaluation methodology or a self-assessment that's on their website, and you can look at it, which benchmarks and benchmarks or sets benchmarks and has specific evaluation criteria. It has a weighting and ranking system of these outcomes and a scoring system so that you can look at your project and say, you know, we're heading towards this or we're not. A big focus, obviously, is on resilience and helping countries achieve their sustainable development goals through the tool. And then the things that it looks at, which are critically important in People First PPPs, is access and equity, economic effectiveness, and fiscal sustainability. The third one is critically important, sustainability and resilience. Can these values or principles or practices be replicable? And then one thing that's important also is that you can then, once you've identified it and you've scaled or ranked yourself, you can actually get a certification or validation from the United Nations on your project. The next slide. So I'm handing over now to Richard Saline, who will talk about his aspects of drivers or P3s and the need and available resources. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David, for that lead in. And then, of course, thank you to David Dodd and Kim for organizing this. I'm honored to be on the panel. I fear that given the brain power that's not only on the panel, but folks that are joining us around the world are a lot smarter than I am. So with apologies, I'll try to live up to the expectations of the brilliance. But in all honesty, I'm going to make a point and then Kim, have you transition to the slides. 2 points. One is people first. I think the reality that we've discovered, David, as you mentioned, and I'll talk about this in a second, Texas, which is where we're headquartered, but we're a national focused national organization. All the concrete and the rebar, all of the different types of projects that can be put in place are critical. But at the end of the day, it's the performance of that infrastructure and those facilities that serve the citizens, residents of these communities. And no need to remind any of us that are on the call today. I think sometimes we have to remind our colleagues, meaning elected and appointed officials, that the performance is ultimately to help communities, neighborhoods, economies become and sustain themselves through what seem to be back-to-back disasters. The second is, I'm going to forewarn all of you that what I'm going to share is a little bit US-centric, but I think David Dodd has heard me say this. Some of the best lessons learned, right, David? Some of the best lessons learned are from around the world in communities and countries that have had to really learn resilience with less resources. And so I want to make sure that anybody that's listening is not viewing this as a US-centric opportunity or discussion, but more importantly, that we all can share best practices. And there's a lot of opportunities for us to learn from you today and going forward. Kim, if you'll. So we look at resilience as defined as pre-disaster risk mitigation. And I'll describe further why we use that definition, and it may be obvious to you all based on what David Baxter just shared. But look, we've had 20 plus 30 years now of increasing number of disasters in the United States. And whether we want to call it climate change, adaptability, whatever it is, the fact is that it is becoming more prevalent, more persistent, and frankly, more costly. And that set of back-to-back disasters from coast to coast, border to border, is driving what we believe is a dominant factor If you don't invest ahead of the curve, it is definitely a lot more expensive. Wharton at Pennsylvania, Columbia, NYU, other universities, along with our partners at the Insurance Information Institute, have already identified that it is a 1 to 4 return on the investment if we will invest ahead of the curve. Kim, if you'll click. So I showed you that previous slide that looked at for 20 years. All right. Now just looking at 2019, the number of disasters, some of them are ones that you're very familiar with, but it also indicates that one of the challenges, look at the dates. Look at the dates. So FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, has essentially said that they no longer can be 911, meaning they cannot own all of the recovery, the rebuild, as they shouldn't, all right? But what is in reality, back-to-back disasters is creating, and I think, David, you referenced this, do we have the capacity? Well, that capacity may not be always at the national level. It is primarily the burden of the local and regional, not just government, but the private sector. So I wanted to build to the next slide, Kim, or the next graphic. So following on to David Baxter, we have had in Texas, and I'm going to use Texas again as kind of an example. It is not intentional to be the only center of the universe, even though we Texans sometimes think we are. The fact is that we've had 6 back-to-back floods and hurricanes. We've had fires. We've had back-to-back droughts. And then suddenly, we had the most persistent day-to-day, hour upon hour freeze, snow, and ultimately degradation of our energy and water supply. Not that we were warned 10 years ago after a major freeze and slight snowfall then that something needed to happen. So let's be very, very clear that when we talk about people first P3s, that we have got to remind our elected and appointed officials that they are not alone in making these decisions, that we all are a part of the decision-making process. But more importantly, there are a lot more resources available than just the government to invest in these types of projects and technologies. So I wanted to emphasize that if you look at what's occurred in Texas, it is true around the United States and I think around the world. What I didn't mention is, obviously, this is during the same period for which we are dealing with COVID. And all of what COVID has presented is that we have reduced 10 years out, meaning that there is a belief that a lot of the changes that were going to occur in the economy, whether it's moving from carbon to more clean, whatever that process a decade out has completely shrunk to probably less than 2 to 3 years. So what's happening around us is a major pivot of our facilities, of our infrastructure, of our sectors, and most importantly, our communities, which I know Joel will talk about in a minute. But this is the emphasis to me. When you have, and by the way, this map is not accurate to what occurred 48 hours later. There are 254 counties in the state of Texas. Every county in the state was impacted in some way or another due to the frost and the snow. Go to the next slide if you don't mind. So I just mentioned 254 counties in the state of Texas, 50 states, national government. One of the challenges is that we are very fragmented in our governance structures, which is okay, not an opinion, just a reality. Pennsylvania has more townships than any other state in the country. But one of our issues that we've discovered is it is not a lack of resources. It really isn't. It is a challenge to finding ways to get through the maze of all of these different sources for P3s. And I want to emphasize before I hand it off to Joel in a second is, and David Dodd and I have talked about this, we may have to figure out how to flavor this, but we call these P4s. Private, philanthropic, public partnerships. And putting people first essentially drives home that there is now a greater ability to leverage corporate equity and insurance than we ever have. Through our work with the Insurance Information Institute, the Global Insurance and Reinsurance, I believe that we are now seeing a domino begin to fall that essentially says either A, you're going to invest, meaning citizens, residents, communities, industry, you're going to invest, and we may be able to invest side by side with you. We may be able to incentivize through our policies, meaning the insurance policies. At the same time, we've lost $1 trillion on the US Gulf Coast alone over the past 7 years, meaning we, insurance and reinsurance and FEMA and others. We cannot sustain losses. So either we incentivize action or we penalize it. And one of the penalties is beginning to take a look at the cost of insurance. So I wanted to emphasize as a bridge between David Baxter and Joel, that is not without resources. It is actually, what is the mechanism? What is the business model? What is the way to create the appropriate transaction? And by including people, by including the community in the process, I think we open the door to not only additional resources, but newer types of business models. I want to stop there, Joel, hand it off to you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, David, and Kim. Really glad to be here with you all. Again, my name is Joel Thomas. I'm the founder and CEO of Spin Global. We're a public benefit corporation based in Maryland that's really spent a lot of time focused on this topic, and I'm excited to share just a few perspectives. Just to get some interaction for a moment, I'm just curious if you could engage in the chat with me for a moment. I'm curious, two things. Where are you located right now? And are you currently involved in a PPP, or have you been involved in a PPP? If you could just begin to put that in, I'll continue my remarks and we can come back to that in a moment. But I think when I think about this topic and looking at, all right, how do we move from where we are today to where we could be? I think about some of the challenges and barriers that are there. And I think the first thing is, I think we've got to broaden the aperture for what we think about and focus on the whole community and the opportunity to engage the whole community. Typically, people think about this topic and often people relate to finance or infrastructure-based projects. My goal today is to help us consider looking at engaging not just these hard, quote, hard PPPs, but the soft sort of programmatic engagement in resilience, response recovery efforts, tying economic development and emergency management is where I spend a lot of my time, focusing on the Homeland Security and emergency management community. Let's think about this last year. I actually, for several years, have worked with many directors of emergency management around the country. And frankly, for several years, I've had conversations where people are like, why do we need to engage the private sector? I don't understand. And then some were like, okay, I think I get it, but how? How would we do that? And then the problem of, well, we don't have money for it. And I just want to tell you really a tale of two cities, really not two cities exactly, but let's think about COVID, what's happened in the last year, which I think if anybody disbelieved in the necessity of the private sector and the role of the private sector, I think now this last year has demonstrated the absolute undebatable necessity of the private sector in cooperation with government. From everything from the White House when they announced in March that they were working with testing and big pharma companies, to New Orleans, where city restaurants used FEMA funds to provide 30,000 meals a day to residents, to tech companies like Zoom that offered and scaled their technology platform that literally enabled continuity of operations around the world for many small businesses, families, and big businesses alike. Think about nonprofits that already existed, Meals on Wheels, that substantially scaled their meals to seniors to help them be able to stay at home and follow those stay-at-home orders and also be able to get food. Consider states like California, Washington that stepped in and partnered with philanthropic organizations to provide financial assistance to undocumented immigrants who are ineligible for relief funds. Consider also the millions of children and adults who at home stepped up to the plate and made masks in the early days when we were short, and they were giving them to local hospitals, including my own community. We had people doing mask sewing lines and delivering them to local hospitals to sort of fill the gaps. And even let's broaden the aperture a little further to a totally informal, unexpected example. In El Salvador, criminal gangs partnered with the government to enforce stay-at-home orders. They had some mutual interests at the time. So I want to say all of these examples reflect remarkable innovation that came from cooperation and collaboration between public and private. And I think the opposite is what we just heard from Richard. Let's look at Texas. Isolation. So the first tale is a tale of look at, for all the flaws in the response to COVID, the community, the whole community participated in actually helping to address the crisis at hand. And then in Texas, we had isolationist policies in an energy industry that led to no cooperation, no responsibility, no connectedness or limited connectedness to be able to conduct mutual aid with nearby state energy folks next door. It led to no readiness and ultimately a catastrophe. And by being isolated, not connected, not having an aperture where we're thinking about the need for one another and the need and the role of the whole community, we had a big problem. So with that as my preamble, let's advance to the first slide. I've been involved, as David introduced, in advising FEMA on the development of a guide called Building Private-Public Partnerships. And we'll flip that, private-public, not to in any way diminish the role of government, but to accentuate the role of an opportunity for the private sector as the owners and operators of infrastructure. As we look at the whole community, private citizens that make up our country, and grassroots leaders, community leaders of NGOs, faith-based organizations that have the social connections that are necessary. We have to think in terms of capital, not just financial capital, but social capital and other forms of capital. But I'd like to start with a definition, and the definition offered in that guide is a private-public partnership is defined as any type of informal or formal cooperative arrangement between two or more organizations from private industry, and I'll say private industry with the broadest aperture. That includes NGOs, philanthropic organizations, et cetera, and the public sector for their mutual benefit. That's a really key point, for their mutual benefit, designed to ensure life safety, economic security, and community resilience. And so really when we talk about people first, P3s, I was thrilled to be part of this conversation. I actually wanted to maybe add a P5. Richard talked about P4. Let's put a people, private, philanthropic, public partnerships. I actually would love to have called expanded the definition even further, but for practical reasons, we're talking about P3s right now. And expanding it beyond just the traditional, let's build projects, economic development type stuff, to resilience, response, and recovery. And in the emergency management community, I'd say the lowest hanging fruit was emergency managers see big box companies or supply chain and logistics companies as partners in response to deliver commodities. But it's very great and good. So we're not having government recreate solutions that the private sector is already equipped and positioned to do, and frankly to deliver better than the government in a more cost-effective manner. But one of the challenges has been to let's get out of the whack-a-mole mentality. Let's get out of react and let's get into being proactive in resilience. How can we partner together to build resilience, to focus on mitigation, to reduce risk in simple terms, for socially vulnerable, economically vulnerable, built environment vulnerable, natural environment vulnerable locations and geographies and places and people. I think also in a recovery standpoint, frankly, I'll be honest with you, in the emergency management community, the measure of success is typically, did we spend money? Did we do a project? Are we checking boxes? It's not, are we making the community more resilient? And I think there's a huge opportunity to direct recovery dollars to align with and be harmonized with economic development agendas, policies, priorities in local communities, so that when huge influxes of billions of dollars, like we're seeing right now, and we saw frankly before COVID, but we're seeing now in spades, from hurricanes to wildfires to floods everywhere, how can we actually be smart with our investments? To me, it all starts with a people-centric approach. What are the needs of the people? What are the needs of our moms, of our neighbors? And starting there, not just focusing on navel-gazing at the government and industry needs, and which often is the starting point, and it's a good point. But I think we need to drill down and challenge ourselves to look further. So next slide. I think this next image for me crystallizes why. And that is, resilience starts at the individual and family level, right? Resilient households, and there's all sorts of types of households. But what do households need? What do we need to live? Think Maslow's hierarchy of needs a little bit, right? Or in emergency management speak, think, community lifelines. We need access to, in the 21st century, power, water, communications, transportation, public health services, etc., right? These are the things that we need. And if we have access to, and if we have stability, then it enables resilience. It reduces risk and losses, like we're seeing in Texas right now. The instability, the fragility, of the energy system in Texas is going to be a lesson that I think we're going to remember for decades and to come. And I hope that we learn from. To not do it that way. I think there's also an opportunity to unleash the power and innovation of the private sector to focus on how do we make this more resilient. And let's be a never again moment, never forget and never again moment where we do it differently. And so I think we've got to boil down these big ideas into, okay, what does this mean for the family and the household? Next slide, please. So as we navigate that, and a lot of the work I do with governments, local, state, national, international governments, we're frankly driven by resources. I've seen articles in the news about FEMA's tasked to do so much work. Countries all around the world are tasked to do so much, but they don't have the resources. The reality is, we can print more money and we can get more resources for the moment, but this is an infinite game. Disasters happen because we place ourselves in the way of hazard, and an increase of population, infrastructure, future conditions, climate change. The reality is the trend is not going to go down. And I think the only way we can disrupt the impact of disasters is to mitigate and to reduce risk and to be proactive. And I think we need guidance. And so I've been involved in shaping guidance at the state level with the National Emergency Management Association, and that's led to developing national guidance that FEMA is getting ready to publish. They had a national comment period on that guide that I mentioned earlier that you can access at the link on the screen. In addition, there's a brand new course, FEMA certified course. It's getting ready to be launched, called the Whole Community Economic Recovery course. It's coming soon. If you're interested in having that course come to your community, there's an opportunity for communities around the country to sign up and bring that course to your community, paid for and subsidized by the federal government. In the middle, you see this Planning B. I really wish that state of Texas and the electric infrastructure had worked using this, but this is an example from the state of North Carolina. If you're an emergency manager or have any knowledge in that area, you may have seen the Planning P. It's how we do planning, a multi-step process. Well, how do we do that with businesses? Right? How do you engage businesses? North Carolina did a fantastic job coming up with a process for integrating businesses into daily operations, response, and recovery, literally marking the step-by-step journey, all the different ways. This is a great resource and a guide, and frankly, something I think that can be expanded upon. Get rid of daily operations and put resilience on the left side. What do we do? Steady state resilience, response, and recovery. Some other tools and resources for the whole community. A platform that my company offers as part of our public benefit. It's free of use for individuals, families, houses of worship, non-government organizations that have literally tens of thousands have used it all over the world in over 20 countries. It's called planetready.com. You can go there and based on your location, understand your risk and vulnerability to different disasters and then take action with training and exercises to reduce your risk. Oftentimes we're seeing a disconnect in here's guidance and resources and understanding threat and vulnerability drives, the cooperation and action. And so this tool allows you to sort of understand your risk, threat and vulnerability, and then move forward. And then Responder CQ, it's a tool that's been used by NATO, countries around the world, New Zealand, to assess all sorts of capability assessments, whether for the business community or whole of government. We did a workshop with the whole of New Zealand government, from the Prime Minister's office to the City of Wellington, to conduct a national assessment on their crisis management capabilities, for example. So these are some guidelines and resources. I just want to put out some links. You've got them here on the slides to say that I think the moment we're in is, 5 years ago when really started working with a bunch of the states. 6 years ago, really started working with the states. It was, we need guidance. We need a roadmap. And so 5 years later, we've got a lot of resources at state, national level. And by the way, the FEMA national guidance is tailored for the local application. It's tailored toward local communities. It's not tailored for big government. It does scale, and there's a maturity model that focuses on government, private industry, and whole community partners. But it's tailored for application at the lowest common denominator. And with the resources that are available, I think we're now at a turning point where, okay, we all know we need to be more resilient. I think if you're on this call, hopefully you recognize the need for PPPs or P4s or P5s. And I think we've got some resources that I hope you'll take advantage of and use to help implement your community. With that, I will pause. I know we're going to have some discussion, but thanks again for the opportunity to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel. And actually, thank you, Joel. Thank you, David and Richard, for that. Joel, I love your energy. Somebody on the chat window said amen. And I was listening to you going, preach, Joel, preach. So it's good to hear the energy and enthusiasm for this. So again, I want to remind everyone who's joining us, please feel free to add your questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And thanks to Phyllis for already submitting one. I'm just going to get us started with a broad question, and then we'll pull in everyone's comments. But so, here we've heard from the panelists, we've heard that there are new principles and paradigms for structuring P3s. We heard from Richard that, resources are out there, that they're available. And we've heard from Joel that there's been some innovation really in how disparate groups have come together for COVID. And yet, I think we would all say there's still barriers holding us back from doing more projects. So in the spirit of the title of this webinar is Practical Tools and Tips for implementing these P3s. I want to, Richard, maybe I'm going to start with you and throw it to you and say, practically speaking, how do you think this community, can work to overcome these barriers that still exist here?
Let me tie into something that Joel, in his enthusiasm, because Joel, usually I'm out of my chair and bouncing off the walls, but I've only had one cup of coffee this morning. But
oh, no excuses. I only had a cup of tea this morning, Richard. No,
but and I'm going to apologize, Kim, right up front, because I'm going to use a little verbiage that we use down here in the South. All right. Single number one practical right up front. Hurricane Harvey hit city of Houston. And by the way, this is true all across the country, and I think all around the world. We call it the Get Shit Done networks. These are the 10,000, and I call them kids because now I'm 61, all right? But these are individuals who did not wait for FEMA's permission, the state, the county. They literally, some of you have heard about the Cajun Navy from Louisiana, the Texas Navy. These are people who just got in boats, fishing boats, whatever it was, to go. Look, Joel has said it right up front. first and foremost, if elected and appointed officials don't recognize, frankly, the Get Shit Done networks that not only operationalize before, during a disaster, but actually stick around after everybody's gone, we need to find a way to get them at the table. Practical solution number one, get individuals at the table who actually fill in the cracks of the more traditional efforts during these types of disasters and impediments, let's call that. Second one, Kim, and I'll try to make this quick, all right? If we don't do procurement and contracting reform, we'll never be able to maximize, Joel, you stole my line, unleashing innovation for resilience, all right? If we don't change procurement and contracting, instead of governments telling me that they want to have a trolley painted this color with these kinds of wheels and the handle of this, just tell me that you want to move the sand from this place to the next place, and let me in the private sector or even the philanthropic sector, whoever it is, come together and come up with the best solution that's most efficient and effective and frankly economical. Third piece, practical. Our supply chains keep on falling apart. So when we think about P3s, we tend to gravitate towards large scale concrete and rebar projects, all right? We need to understand exactly where soft infrastructure, and that is the reason why People First is a part of the soft infrastructure. And I think David and Joel would agree that what we need to recognize is that P3s can be a part of bringing tools together that are ways of best practices. So a practical is, somebody asked this earlier, we don't know where our supply chains are, but I will tell you, HEB Grocers, which you all probably have heard about, and if you haven't, go look out. This is our #1 grocer in the state of Texas. But HEB, Costco, Walmart, truck 1112 has 15 pallets. One of those pallets is going to arrive in a city at 5:45. Why is it that the private sector, Joel, knows where its inventory is, and why do we keep on relying on public sector to be the only managers of critical inventory? So I'm going to hand it off, but I think there are some very practical things that we need to recognize that are non-traditional. David?
Yeah, thank you, Joel and Richard. I think you mentioned some very, very important things. Some of the things that I think we can do also is, what I call moving from legislative paralysis to actual acts on the ground. Every time there's a disaster, legislatures and governments say we need to do this, we need to pass these laws, we're going to do it, and then they never do it. And everyone's morally indignant that it happened and promises to fix it, and they don't do that. And I think you're referring to 10 years ago in Texas after the first big storm that you had, everyone got terribly excited, we need to change legislation, we need to protect everything. And from what I understand, about diddly squat happened. So, we need to move from that. We also need to move really from policy to practice. And I think that's what both Joel and Richard are saying. There's manuals out there, there are books out there, there are guidelines out there, up the yin yang. But, how many times are people actually implementing that and actually turning that into a practical experience? So, let's not spend millions or billions of dollars on planning and all that, but we actually don't do anything about it. Both of the previous speakers also really talked about leaning into the private sector. If anything that the COVID pandemic has taught us is that the public and the private sector have critical resources that each other needs. And it makes no sense to create silos where they seem to want to work against one another and say, well, this is a public sector thing, or this is a private sector thing. Guess what? We live in a world where we all need to integrate our resources and to collaborate. And a lot of people don't realize, I think it was both Joel and Richard talked about how Texas created this own grid and kept itself isolated from everyone. So no other states could help them. There was no integration of resilience. And what most people, I don't even think have heard that, because the focus has been so on Texas, is no one realizes what it did to northern Mexico. Here's northern Mexico, the oil and gas couldn't get there because Texas couldn't pump oil and gas there. So there's a failure, an economic failure in northern Mexico as well, which wasn't northern Mexico's fault. It was policymakers in Texas who created the scenario that led to it. And then I just think we really, really need to focus on integrating the resources of all sectors in that. And, I agree, if, Richard, as you were saying, if, the big trucking companies, if Amazon and everything know absolutely at every second of the day where everything is, and they can send me a text and say that somebody's going to be knocking on my door in 5 minutes time, and there's going to be a parcel deposited on my doorstep, and you need to be there because it's valuable, the government should be able to say, we are going to be able to deliver water to communities that are struggling because they suddenly don't have water. And I was watching the news last night, and a fascinating article of disabled veterans in Virginia who put together an effort, and they loaded up a truck full of water and drove it for 22 hours nonstop through the night to Texas to deliver water, and Texas couldn't even deliver water to communities down its own street. So I'll get off my soapbox, but those are some of the things that I felt were important to say.
Great. I want to reference one of the questions from our audience and make sure we address those. So thank you, Phyllis, for submitting this. You guys, all of you, frankly, have talked about some of these resources as well as the challenge of navigating them. So we'd love to get your thoughts on how you foresee technology stepping in to help here. This is from Phyllis. She mentions, with the ease of that we have in using things like social media in other parts of life, what about global registry of services, using big data, AI, automation, and other of these tech-driven tools to mobilize during times of need? What are you guys seeing and thinking about in this area? Joel, can I send it to you first?
Sure. I think absolutely. I think there's, in my mind, there's a couple of major drivers that are going to force us to change the way we think and operate. One of them is the economics of disasters. And I think the other piece is how we actually do the job sort of before, during, and after disasters. And I think technology is a big deal. As we see the increase in number of disasters, we don't magically have that many more certified and trained personnel, within one industry. It's going to take the whole community. It's going to take everybody. And technologies, I think, are going to be key to helping provide a data-driven approach to isolate and target, sort of triage, to use language from paramedics. Okay, what are the riskiest, high risk, most vulnerable parts of the community, to community lifelines, to infrastructure, to social vulnerabilities, and how do we prioritize and triage? The only way we can do that is by using big data to focus on a risk-based assessment to inform before, steady state, during, and after how and where we prioritize the limited resources that we have. So using data on businesses, industries, population demographics, social vulnerability, et cetera, is going to be key. Technology is key in terms of being able to facilitate the rapid production expansion, supply chain logistics that are necessary, as we saw with COVID. And, the world's growing. And the trend is upward on these things. So yeah, I think
Joel, I'm a slightly pushback.
Yeah.
Even though you and I are like 200% in agreement, and maybe it's not a slight, not a pushback, but to Phyllis's point. So what we're currently doing a curation and inventory of all of these different tools. All right. American Flood Coalition, who we're working with, has a tool called the Flood Fund Finder. Where that helps is that a lot of the large cities and large communities, they've got engineers, they've got people who do nothing but work on this. But it's your smaller communities, which tend to be more vulnerable because they don't have the staff, but need to find where the resources are. There's a group out of Houston, they're not the only ones, called Humanity, UMANITY. Joel goes a little bit to what you and I, talked about. Basically, they're trying to find a way to connect the needs and the demands. So, one of the problems, Joel, as you know, is that I've got 250 mills on one side of the county, and the real need is on another side of the county, and people don't know how to connect with each other. All right, that's what happened during the, with COVID and the food banks. But the third part of it is that what we're finding, and I think one of our colleagues is on the phone, Mike Gardner from AKX. What we're finding is, and David, I'll hand this off to Baxter, I'll hand this off to you with just a real quick observation, and that is right now, in a lot of communities across the country, we are about ready or already spending billions of dollars for the next new concrete and rebar project. I keep on using that as a phrase, but the next big project. What we don't know and don't seem to have figured out is how to connect alternative financing, alternative resources. So 2 items. One is, how do we now start bringing nature-based green infrastructure into the equation? Not because engineers aren't used to it, but there is frankly, a disconnect. The other part is, and I want to be very blunt about this, Kim, look, it's hell being poor. It's really hell being poor and going through back-to-back disasters. So the low to moderate income neighborhoods are the ones that usually are downstream from floods. They're in the middle of persistent. And I think there is greater attention, for all the reasons we know, to now incorporate finding ways to engage low to moderate income neighborhoods once and for all, but to, frankly, as Joel would say, help them engage permanently in owning the resilience. David Baxter?
I know we're limited for time, so I just want to say one thing. I'm a great fan, and absolutely the times we're living at of technology. I think one thing we need to be guarded against is what I call technology complacency, and understand that technology itself is not a panacea for disaster, resilience, management, recovery, etc. UCOT in Texas knew it was coming. They planned for it. They had all the warnings and everything, and it came, and look where they found themselves. There were meetings before, we're heading for the storm of the century. And so it's, in a sense, technology is only good as the human input as well. And this is, where the people need to be consulted again, because you can have the most fantastic systems. I also think of countries or communities, which you just touched on, Richard, which are poorer. What is the scale of that technology that is used, to protect them? And, often when I work in African countries, I say, you don't need the latest state of the art technology if there's good technology that's even 5 years old and it works. So, these are the things that we do need to consider. Cost is always going to be a consideration for preparing for this and for the new technology in that, but it seems that the cost is even higher if we don't do anything. And David, you just sent a message saying that it's going to be $100 billion possibly for Texas. Can you imagine if you spent $100 billion on disaster preparation? It would have covered the whole United States, not just Texas.
But David, just quickly, that is the storm, which also included all of northern Louisiana, over 1 million people, and parts of southern Arkansas and western Mississippi. So, but that estimate was given this morning that it could approach $100 billion.
So David Baxter, let me play off of it. And I'm not defending Texas, although I'm a 4th generation Texan. But let's get down to the practical one more time. All right. There are enough resources to do what we need to do. Public, private, philanthropic. It is never a resource issue. And I have to say, anybody who tells me that it's a resource issue, it is not. It is a mismatch of resources. It is a mismatch of the resource allocation mechanisms. So let's talk about the practical. And this is where I'd like to kind of leave it out for our panel discussion. And David Dodd, I'm going to say this. What is our call to action? Those on the phone, those are listening. What is our call to action? we can all say the same things that we've been saying. Look, I've read every after action report since Hurricane Andrew. I must lead a boring life. But David Baxter, you and I both know the expertise exists, the capital exists, all right? And frankly, global best practices by people who don't need to have access to all the technology. What I am still concerned about is that unless we disrupt the process by which we are going to handle resilience going forward, then we will be back 10 years from now having the same conversation. And the only way to disrupt it is to get, frankly, the private sector and the philanthropic sectors coming together with their resources, with the data, as Joel has said, with the performance metrics, to look at, frankly, a new performance-based contracting, new mechanisms. And frankly, folks, it's time to say to elected and appointed officials, partner or get the hell out of the way.
Amen to that. I'm really glad that you made the comment that we have all the resources. I've been in many government-led resource allocation workshops that did not include private sector. They discuss it. And when you think about practical takeaways, I think about, if you, wherever you sit, private sector, public sector, what spheres of influence do you have? And look around the table. Who's there and who's not there? Are the owners and operators of, different community assets or resources or infrastructure there? How's the relationship between public and private organizations as far as you can control? I think it all starts with relationships, and honestly, for years that's the truth. It also annoys me because a lot of people use it as an excuse not to sort of formalize and grow something more systematically, and that's the reason for some of the guidance that I've been part of putting together, is to try to evolve sort of cult following relationship based PPPs into sort of the way we do business. This is just the way we work. We recognize that we all need each other, and we're coming to the table on everything from planning, training, exercises, real world response recovery, real world investments and resilience, on everything. We should have cooperation with people, grassroots leaders, non-governmental organizations, private sector, philanthropic, and government. So I think, to me, the most practical thing I could offer you to take away is who's around the tables that you sit at and who's not. That's actually maybe the more important question. Who's not, and how do you get them there?
Yeah, I would add also one thing, that it's critical for us to be flexible and innovative on our feet, because the world is changing, and what is the reality now in 5 years' time or even next year could be different. So the systems, the practices, the approaches that we develop have to be flexible as well. And that means that, if your plan is not working, but you have a strategy to work with a plan that's not working, evolve that. And it sounds rather, oxymoronic to say that, but so many times people say the plan failed because it didn't work. Well, where were the people on the ground thinking on their feet and making things happen?
Yeah, David, I want to, and I know we got 1 second, so I'm going to cap it off on an observation. After living in Washington, D.C. for 27 years and coming back home, I walked out with coining a phrase: every inefficiency has a constituency. We need to find the champions that actually want to do stuff. Trying to convince people to change their minds, change their cultures is a difficult battle, but every inefficiency has a constituency. And what I think all are seeking are champions who really want to move the dial. Let's get with them. Let's get behind them. Eventually, there'll be enough confidence by others to make the moves. Kim, I'm sorry, I'll put myself on mute.
You're all good. So you've actually just made my point for me. Obviously, 1 hour conversation is not enough to really discuss and figure out these important issues. So with that, I want to make sure everyone is aware. To continue the conversation, you can connect with everyone here on LinkedIn. We'll be making the slides and the recording available on the ISRC website, so you can check it out there. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to David Dodd, our host, to close us out just very quickly today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. A really engaged audience, which always makes us better. 3 completely fantastic panelists, and Kim, who always does an awesome job of keeping things on track. And I want to just thank everyone that attended. There are questions that we will still answer. We have information for you guys, and we can contact you directly. And if there are any other questions that you think of, please, don't hesitate to contact us. You can jump on LinkedIn. But thank you again. It was a great session. We're going to continue this. We'll have another webinar in late March, and we certainly want to get you back. This is something we're doing to try to help in this incredible, unprecedented time to help people cope with the combination of COVID and disasters at record levels. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.